This subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, question, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. In recent months, violent attacks in Europe and expanding jihadist networks in northern Africa have provided tragic and senseless reminders of the threat that terrorism and extremism pose to the world. As we discuss the global fight against the threat of terrorism, we don't first think of Southeast Asia, but this vibrant region, home to nearly 40% of the world's Muslim population, is also a crucial part of the global war on terror. Southeast Asia captures less U.S. media attention than other headline-grabbing flashpoints, but the region's efforts to combat extremism are vital to maintaining stability in some of the world's most successful Muslim majority states, and ultimately to protecting the security of our homeland. Today we'll discuss Southeast Asia's efforts to counter the threat of violent extremism, many of them successful, as well as possible opportunities for improvement. In this hearing, we will focus on the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, but Southeast Asia as a whole is at particular risk for extremist activity. This area is home to large Muslim population, very porous borders, and persistent governance challenges and development needs. Militant Islamist separatists and terrorists have operated in the region for decades, but the fight against such groups has yielded some successes for the United States and our partners. The southern Philippine Islands have long been home to active Islamist separatist and terrorist organizations. President Bush included the Philippines as part of the front lines of the global war on terror following 9/11 and launched an effort that helped the Filipinos significantly degrade these groups. These efforts are due in large part to joint counter-terror operations between Philippine and U.S. armed forces, as well as close integration between our counterterrorism and development assistance. The Aquino administration has also made significant progress toward settling Islamic separatist violence in Mindanao with the signing of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, despite the Philippine Congress's slow progress toward implementing the terms of the agreement. Although the Philippines has enjoyed some success, it continues to feel the pain of extremist activities. 18 Filipino soldiers were killed earlier this week in a clash with Abu Sayyaf group. Islamist militancy has similarly been a decades-long challenge for Indonesia. Indonesia has seen more than its share of domestic terrorist attacks, including the horrific Bali bombings in 2002 and several other attacks in the following years. In response, the government of Indonesia has built up formidable counter-terror capabilities in its military and its police force, thanks in considerable part to considerable U.S. capacity building. It's also taking great strides in countering militant recruitment by marginalizing those who advocate violence and convincing the vast majority of Indonesians that such acts run counter to the teachings of Islam. However, the Muslim majority nation of 253 million people continues to suffer tragic terrorist attacks, most recently the bomb and gunfire attack in Jakarta in January of this year. Observers credit the Indonesian government, including the gifted leadership of President Jokowi, for the comparatively minor damage that the attack caused. While Malaysia doesn't have a history of indigenous separatists or insurgencies carrying out terrorist attacks, its government has recognized the rising threat posed by global Islamic radicalism and has taken significant measures to counteract this threat. Malaysia continues to promote the moderate practice of Islam and has shifted resources to preventing militancy from taking root in its outlying provinces. Malaysia also continues to step up its counterterrorism cooperation multilaterally and bilaterally, including support from ASEAN and participation in the global coalition to counter ISIL. We've got to ensure that the positive momentum in the fight against extremism in Southeast Asia is not lost. Unfortunately, these successes have been put at risk by changes in the landscape of extremism. Most concerning is the influence of Islamic State, its malicious and virile technology and the internationalization of violence that it promotes. Hundreds of Southeast Asians have joined the Islamic State's ranks in Syria and Iraq to forge new transnational links between the Islamic State and indigenous Southeast Asian extremists. The Islamic State has reached out to Southeast Asians through social media, encouraging acts of violence. There's no formal Islamic State affiliate in Southeast Asia today, but there is a threat that linkages to the Islamic State could empower militants and rekindle a broader terrorist threat in the region. As global terror and extremism evolves, our strategy must do the same. Today we're going to discuss how these new challenges will affect counterterror and counter-violent extremism in the region. I was just recently in Indonesia within the last couple of weeks, and I met with the newly appointed Minister of Counterterrorism, an upgrade, I guess, from being the Chief of Police. And I can tell you that this is front and center on their minds, and they're very, very concerned about potential calamities in addition to the ones they've already had. But I was able to go to one of the madrasas and meet with some of the student leaders, and I was really impressed with the caliber of these young people that I met and the fact that they stand with us against extreme factions within Islam. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel to develop a better understanding of the administration's strategy for this crucial aspect of U.S. foreign policy and to identify further concerns that may need attention from this committee. And I'd like to recognize the ranking member today, Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you and Ranking Member Sherman for putting together this important hearing today and for our panelists for coming to share their insights and their thoughts. While the world focuses on Islamic extremist threats that are facing countries in the Middle East and North Africa, it's critical that we not ignore this growing threat that we are seeing in other countries, in particular in Southeast Asia, which speaks to why this hearing is important. The chairman talked about Indonesia, where we saw an ISIS-linked attack in the capital, Jakarta, with 8 people being killed last January. Other countries in the region also being very densely populated, where the concern is that continued attacks could lead to extensive casualties as well as great damage to those communities. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what the U.S. is doing to help stop the spread of extremism in these countries. While it's not directly within this region, I do also want to mention Bangladesh, a country that continues to face growing violent jihadist problem. Last week, Nazimuddin Samad, a secular activist, was hacked to death in Dhaka, following a horrific pattern that we have seen there now for the last year. A few months ago, I introduced a resolution calling on the government of Bangladesh to protect the rights of all of its religious minorities, including Christians, Hindus, atheists, and others, from these kinds of attacks. We must take action in these countries while there still is a chance to prevent groups like ISIS and their extremist ideology from growing. Thank you very much again for being here. Look forward to hearing from you. I yield back.
Thank you. We're joined today by Mr. W. Patrick Murphy, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast Asia in the Departments of State's Bureau of East Asia and the Pacific, Dr. Marie Richards, Deputy Counterterrorism Coordinator for Regional and Multilateral Affairs in the Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism, and Ms. Gloria Steele, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Asia. And we're really grateful to have all of these witnesses today, and we look forward to learning more about what's going on within the administration to deal with these issues. And we'll first turn to Mr. Murphy.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Gabbard, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today on the very important and timely issue of countering violent extremism in Southeast Asia. I also thank the committee for its sustained support of our broad engagement across the East Asia Pacific region, exemplified by the chairman's recent travel. Thank you very much for visiting us. The United States and our partners across Southeast Asia work together to address challenges that transcend borders, including infectious disease, trafficking in persons, wildlife, illicit narcotics, organized crime, and of course, terrorism. As President Obama told his ASEAN counterparts at the Sunnyland Summit just this February, our global counterterrorism strategy is informed in no small part by the successes over many years of Southeast Asian nations in disrupting terrorist plots, arresting sympathizers of terrorist organizations, and establishing mechanisms to counter extremist narratives. The January attack in Jakarta, referred to by the chairman and the ranking member, and other recent attacks around the world, however, demonstrate that terrorist organizations, including ISIL, can support and inspire violence almost anywhere. That's why we are building partnerships with the countries in Southeast Asia facing the most active terrorist threats, including Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and others, as well as regional organizations like ASEAN. Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim majority democracy, has seen success using a rule of law-based approach to counterterrorism. Government and civil society leaders have forcibly denounced ISIL. Still, according to Indonesian officials, there are about 300 Indonesians actively fighting in Iraq and in Syria. While this is a small fraction of Indonesia's 250 million plus population, the existence of such fighters and the January 14th attack in Jakarta underscore ISIL's ability to attract recruits and inspire violence in that country. In response, the Indonesian government recently introduced legislation that would give it better tools to counter terrorism. Indonesia is an active member of the Global Counterterrorism Forum. The country's active civil society promotes the local practice of Islam as a positive and tolerant alternative to violent extremist ideologies. To support these efforts, we are working with Indonesia across a range of activities, including training law enforcement and judicial sector officials, sharing information to prevent terrorist travel, providing technical advice on prisoner management, and supporting local counter-messaging efforts. In Malaysia, we are also concerned about ISIL's influence, particularly through online messaging. Since 2013, Malaysian authorities have arrested over 175 terrorist suspects, primarily ISIL supporters, under the country's national security legislation. Malaysia joined the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL last September and announced that it will establish a regional center to counter ISIL messaging. We support these efforts, and we look forward to attending the center's opening in the coming months. We've also strengthened technical assistance since Malaysian Deputy Prime Minister Zahid and Secretary of State John Kerry signed a terrorist watch list sharing arrangement this past October. In the Philippines, terrorist and criminal elements, such as the Abu Sayyaf group, exploit a poor security environment in the southern Mindanao region. Although some terrorist groups have pledged allegiance to ISIL, most are focused on criminality and lack strong ideological motivations. We provide, train, and equip programs to support law enforcement and military forces in the southern Philippines, which have strengthened local capabilities. We're also watching the stalled Mindanao peace process, which will be important for achieving a sustainable political solution and improving the security environment for local populations. Finally, I highlight the excellent work that ASEAN has done to strengthen collaboration in meeting these challenges, including its leading role in achieving East Asia Summit statements on ISIL in 2014 and on countering violent extremism in 2015. We're committed to working into the future with ASEAN on information sharing, border security, and law enforcement cooperation. Mr. Chairman, these partnerships demonstrate the strong and growing commitment in Southeast Asia to push back against ISIL's hateful ideology and all forms of violent extremism. With continued U.S. engagement, backed by congressional support, we're confident the countries in the region will maintain a commitment to tackling terrorism and extremism. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Richards.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Gabbard, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today. As you know, in the world today, we face an increasingly dynamic, diffuse, and geographically decentralized set of terrorist threats. While the United States and our partners have made significant progress in reducing and denying terrorist safe havens, terrorist groups are still able to exploit local conditions and 21st century technology to attract recruits and conduct attacks. This is also true for Southeast Asia. Globally, since 2012, we estimate that at least 36,000 foreign terrorist fighters from more than 120 countries have traveled to Syria and Iraq, including countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia. Some of these fighters have returned home. Some are arrested, but as the trends continue, they are a danger to their own countries. It is clear that ISIL is inspiring terrorist activity in Southeast Asia. As the ranking member has mentioned, ISIL claimed responsibility via its English language online magazine Dabiq for the tragic attack in Jakarta this past January, which was carried out by local pro-ISIS supporters. And as the chairman has noted, our Southeast Asia partners take this threat very seriously. Their law enforcement agencies have performed remarkably well in their efforts to arrest and disrupt terrorist activity. As the chairman said, the Jakarta attack could have been much deadlier if not for the effectiveness of Indonesian authorities. That said, as President Obama has noted, we must develop more effective partnerships and tools to holistically address the evolving terrorist threat environment. We use the framework established by the UN Security Council Resolution 2174, which was passed in the UN General Assembly in 2014, sponsored by the United States. We use this as a framework for working with our partners, including in Southeast Asia, to put in place the fundamental reforms that will stem the flow of foreign fighters and counter violent extremism over the longer term. These points include increasing information sharing among countries, strengthening aviation and border security, implementing or enhancing counterterrorism legislation and supporting prosecutions and investigations, and increasing efforts to counter violent extremism, particularly through strengthening community partnerships. I'll give you a few examples of how we're implementing this approach. To counter the flow of foreign terrorist fighters to conflict zones and returning from them, we are helping our partners strengthen their connectivity with Interpol. So in Malaysia, Malaysia just very recently began systematically reporting to Interpol lost and stolen travel document data. And they recently submitted 12,000 names for lost and stolen passports. We are working with our Southeast Asia partners to build justice sector capacity. So, as you know, Chairman, from your recent visit, Indonesia's improved capacity led to the conviction of Jemaah Islamiyah founder Abu Bakr Bashir, as well as the Bali bomb maker Umar Patek, and they are both now in prison. In the Philippines, the State Department is supporting the FBI, which is assisting the Philippine government in building terrorist finance investigations capacity. And we've had some success there as well. But even as we work to enhance security capacity, we must also work to prevent support for countering violent extremism and recruitment to violence. So throughout Southeast Asia, we are focused on building the capacity of locally based civil society actors in order to counteract terrorist recruitment. We are particularly looking at radicalization to violence in prisons. And we are just at the beginning of this process, but we believe it's important because many people are radicalized in prison. So we are beginning to implement, coming up with some pilot projects to identify terrorist prisoners, to track them through, and to figure out how to remove the threat. Also, when they're brought back into the community, how do we handle that? I'll say in closing that overall, we strongly believe that a whole-of-government, integrated and coordinated approach is the only way to effectively address these threats over the longer term. And our partnerships in Southeast Asia are vitally important, as you have mentioned, to our collective effort to counter terrorism globally, as well as in the region. I look forward to discussing these important issues with you today, and thank you for holding this hearing.
Thanks, Dr. Richards. Ms. Steele.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Gabbard, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on USAID's role in addressing the drivers of violent extremism in Southeast Asia. Around the world, violent conflict, fragility, and violent extremism pose significant threats to regional and global security. The costs of conflict in a developmental, economic, and human sense are extraordinary. By neglecting the factors that drive conflict, we ignore the plight of 1.5 billion people living in conflict and fragility around the world. Knowing that violent extremists can exploit conditions of conflict and fragility, the United States government has integrated the prevention and mitigation of conflict and the promotion of resilient, democratic societies as a key part of its defense, diplomacy, and development efforts. Through this approach and in coordination with our host countries and other donors, we help to ensure progress on a broader range of priorities, including eradicating extreme poverty while advancing the U.S. own security and prosperity. At USAID, we focus on addressing the underlying socioeconomic drivers of violent conflict, fragility, and violent extremism. Our multifaceted approach considers host country commitment and capacity, builds local systems and local capacity to address the causes of violent extremism and conflict, and includes women as partners in preventing conflict and building peace. Through our analysis and monitoring, we ensure that our programs are effectively addressing the drivers of conflict in each unique country setting. In the Asia-Pacific, we continue to see rapid economic growth, lifting millions of people out of poverty. At the same time, growing inequality, weak governance, including corruption, social marginalization, and violation of human rights are resulting in unequal access to justice and social services, particularly for members of marginalized populations. All of these issues can be drivers of instability and can contribute to radicalization to violence. USAID's work to advance democracy and promote human rights and good governance help to address these destabilizing factors. We encourage governments to provide all of their citizens with the space to engage in political processes, and we support civil society in voicing citizens' concerns. We work to strengthen the rule of law and government accountability in order to reduce corruption and impunity. We also build capacity for local governments to deliver health and education services. The lack of such services can create opportunities for service provision by extremist groups. We also know that violent extremism respects no boundaries, nor is it limited to any specific ideology. In countries like Burma and Sri Lanka, Muslims are also victims of violent extremism. In both countries, we are promoting tolerance and countering violence against minority, ethnic, and religious groups by encouraging the development of a balanced media and building civil society support for tolerant and inclusive speech. Next, I will provide overviews of the 3 Southeast Asian countries where USAID is addressing drivers of conflict and violent extremism. In Indonesia, impressive democratic and economic progress remains challenged by fragile institutions, corruptions, and as we saw with Jakarta's January terrorist attack, the threat of terrorism. Informed by our assessment of the drivers of violent extremism, USAID is providing access to justice and social services for the poor and the most vulnerable, helping combat corruption, and developing the capacity of civil society and the government to address the grievances of members of marginalized population. We are, in addition, fostering pluralism and tolerance in Indonesia. In the Philippines, despite significant economic and development gains, a resilient democracy, and a strong civil society, the country continues to grapple with recurring insurgencies, politically motivated violence, and some remaining terrorist organizations. Weak governance, including corruption and high levels of marginalization and fragmentation, have made the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao particularly vulnerable. In line with recent assessments, USAID focuses on improving local governments' ability to deliver social services in order to improve their legitimacy. We also focus on fostering greater transparency and accountability in government operations and in fostering stronger civic engagement among local communities. We are helping 20,000 out-of-school youth to engage productively in civic and economic activities. And finally, in southern Thailand, home to one of the most violent conflicts in Asia-Pacific region, USAID is working to increase trust and common understanding among conflicting communities and in fostering religious tolerance. Mr. Chairman, by addressing these destabilizing factors, our development assistance is helping to lay the foundation for security and peace for all of the populations in Asia Pacific and also the U.S. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to your counsel and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll begin with some questions. Southeast Asian nations have very porous borders, making it difficult to track terrorists and challenging to prevent the movement of terror groups. What capabilities do the governments in Southeast Asian countries have to track foreign terrorists who are entering their borders, domestic terrorists moving within a country, and domestic terrorists going abroad for training? What's the current level of information also that's being shared between the United States and Southeast Asian nations? Can I start with you, Mr. Murphy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great question. As you experienced in Indonesia, this is an archipelago. The same could be said for the Philippines, parts of Malaysia. Borders throughout the region are described as porous, lacking in the infrastructure. So the key task from our perspective is information sharing, both with established international organizations, among ASEAN members, and across borders. And as we heard earlier, the President announced an initiative on our part in February to increase information sharing through a $2 million program working with Interpol. And we are already seeing results, particularly in Malaysia. Can't underestimate the success of a program that automatically updates data on a daily basis to capture those last passports and identification materials. We are also collaborating on a bilateral basis with these countries to improve information sharing and through our training programs, whether it's through my colleague's bureau, Counterterrorism Bureau, through our anti-terrorism assistance programs. How can we improve local law enforcement capabilities, border controls, immigration standards, et cetera? And we're starting to see success. There's room for improvement, and you've identified in particular the challenge with the geography of this region.
Dr. Richards, did you want to comment also?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, which is absolutely central to what we're trying to do, particularly on stopping the flow of foreign fighters, but also in preventing safe havens that could protect all sorts of terrorists. We have sponsored a number of regional training opportunities so that countries can come together and talk about their problems and how to work together. But I would like to highlight that we recently sent our special advisor for foreign terrorist fighters, Ambassador Jake Wallace, out to Indonesia and Malaysia to talk about the full range of improvements they might make to their own homeland security system, how we can work together, how we can implement things like this Interpol initiative. So we're working very closely with the governments, talking to them frequently to identify their gaps. This is in coordination with the DHS, Department of Homeland Security here, and with the NCTC, which of course looks at the threat information and can kind of focus for us where the threat is.
That kind of segues to my next question, because the United States and Australia have contributed extensive assistance to the development of Indonesia's elite counterterrorism unit, Detachment 88. How do you assess the track record of Detachment 88, and how can the United States further assist this unit? Is it successful enough that we could try to duplicate it in other countries? And do you believe that Indonesia's counterterrorism efforts, and particularly Detachment 88, have demonstrated sufficient regard for human rights and legal processes? Mr. Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The success of Detachment 88 is quite symbolic of the approach that Indonesia is taking to tackle the terrorism challenge. This is a civilian-led, rule of law-based approach, and this reflects a real transition in the way countries are tackling the challenge. And with our help and contributions, Detachment 88 is a specialized, effective police entity to tackle counterterrorism. And it has produced many arrests, successful prosecutions. I think even more importantly, the thwarting of attacks and threats before they materialize. And so it is something for others to take note of. And we are very pleased with the success and want to encourage more like it.
So what can we do to maybe see things, maybe not exact duplicates, but similar approaches in other countries, or would that be productive?
Well, to some degree, I think, Mr. Chairman, we are seeing similar approaches in other countries, particularly this model of emphasizing a rule of law-based approach to counterterrorism, empowering civilian-led agencies to have the lead, to coordinate across agencies, much like we do here in the United States. This is proving to be more effective. And Detachment 88, as I noted before, having succeeded with numerous arrests, and in the case of the January attack that several of you cited, it could have been much worse. Deeply tragic, the loss of life, in particular the 4 civilians, but I think many analysts see that it could have been much worse. This is the success of this rule of law-based approach that Indonesia has been taking.
Well, my time's expired, so I'll turn to Representative Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we've heard numbers, estimated numbers, in particular coming from Europe with regards to the numbers of foreign fighters who leave that region and go to places like Syria and Iraq to fight. Do you have similar estimates for Southeast Asia along those same lines?
We have a few numbers, and they're included in the written testimony. Essentially, we've seen about 300 foreign fighters going to Indonesia. They bring their families, so the actual number is higher, and a smaller number from Malaysia, about 75. This is, of course, Indonesia is an enormous country, so per capita, it's a relatively small number and much smaller than some European countries and particularly some North African countries. Right. But one person or one small group of people can cause a lot of damage. Right. So although the numbers are relatively small, we take them very seriously.
Right. Dr. Richards, you talked about radicalization in the prisons, which I think is an important area that hasn't often been addressed when looking at this issue. And I wonder if you can speak in a little bit more detail about the pilot projects that you are looking at, if you've seen places where you've gotten best practices or lessons learned, and just I'm interested to hear a little bit more about what you're looking at and what these different countries are looking at.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'll mention that I was in Australia about 6 months ago, I think, for a working group meeting of the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which was mentioned here, which Australia leads this working group together with Indonesia, specifically on the question of prison de-radicalization and reintegration. So we had representatives from a number of Southeast Asian countries. I happened to sit at a table with a Filipino prison official, but also from African countries and some other countries which face this threat. It's very dependent on the capacity of these countries, frankly. In many of these countries, the prisons are overcrowded. There have traditionally not been ways of separating out prisoners. They don't have the capacity to provide real training, job employment prospects. They don't traditionally follow people after they're released from prison and reintegrate them into the society. So the countries working together, and we are working very closely with them, have identified best practices that would work within their societies given their means. And this is now being proposed as an action plan. We're doing trainings. The GCTF is doing trainings. In addition, the United States sponsors a Department of Justice specialist, prison specialist in Indonesia who's been working intensively with the Indonesian prison officials, as I said, starting with a fairly small population, but to provide a model for how they can identify these prisoners and gradually, ideally de-radicalize them, but at least keep them from radicalizing within the prison community.
You mentioned some of the lack of resources in tracking or following people when they leave. With the relatively small number of foreign fighters who leave and then come back to whether it's Indonesia or Malaysia, do they have the resources, and are they tracking and identifying who these individuals are?
In the case of foreign fighters, I'm not sure there's a problem. In the case of Malaysia, for example, they've arrested all the foreign fighters they've identified who came back. It's 8 of them, and they're all in prison. We're more concerned about some of the terrorists who've been in prison for a while, particularly the Bali bomber terrorists who are due to be released. In fact, there are ongoing releases now. So we, as the United States and also the Indonesian government, the Australian government, throughout the region, they're very concerned about what these people could do when they're on the outside. So again, you
mentioned the 300, though, from Indonesia, for example.
Yeah. The 300 went. 60 have been stopped. They've been stopped through this kind of information sharing. Obviously, these are rough numbers, and there may be some out there that we're not aware of. But the problem is more a long-term problem that we see, as with many of these issues.
Yeah. Thank you. And Mr. Murphy, I think you spoke about the online messaging issue and a counter online messaging initiative that's being implemented. Can you speak about this and how they've seen where it's worked and what they're modeling this after?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. You know, online messaging is one of those tools that ISIL has used to some effect in Southeast Asia with its messages of falsehoods, of mischaracterizing Islam and supposed threats against Islam.
I mean, this is something that we see here as well.
That's correct. It's a global challenge, so Southeast Asia is not immune from it. The countries that we partner with in this region understand that very, very well. Malaysia, with its stepped-up cooperation with the international community, initiated on its own a messaging center that will have regional reach. They plan to stand that up in the coming months in Kuala Lumpur, and we look forward to being there and supporting this process. It takes a lot of work to counter the messaging, and it has to be, from our perspective, a local effort. That can't be done from the United States or elsewhere. We have good partners, not just in government, but in civil society. I'll give you an example, Congresswoman. In Indonesia, 2 of the largest Islamic civil society organizations in the world are located there and are some of the most vocal voices when it comes to condemning ISIL and the message of hatred. Those are the kind of partners we're looking at empowering, working with to help with this counter-messaging kind of effort.
Yes, Dr. Richard.
Congresswoman, I just want to take a very short moment to address your comment on Bangladesh, because we completely agree with you. The State Department will be sending a high-level team out to Bangladesh next month to consult with them on what their problem is and how we can help them, and we are doing quite a lot in Bangladesh we can discuss separately.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you you mentioning that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you taking the time and effort to make sure that this hearing happened today on a very significant issue. I remember that back in 2001, the first real attack that I heard of after 9/11 happened in Bali, and I happened to represent Surf City, USA, Huntington Beach, and we took that very seriously. We're just a group of surfers who were frankly enjoying themselves in the evening at one of their local bars. It was blown up, and these are people who are no threat to anyone, which indicated that we were, the world, when you combine that with what happened on 9/11, that the world was into a new challenge that we faced, and the good people of the world. I will have to say that there's some skepticism on the part of some of us as to the way the administration is handling this unique challenge that we face. And I will say there are hints of that today, although let me just say that I have no doubt that each one of you are doing the very best job you can, and I'm grateful for it. I have 3 children who I want to live in a safer world. But I think that quite often this administration is mistaking the fight against radical Islamic terrorists, by the way, a phrase which I have to note doesn't seem to be able to be spoken not only by our president, but even by the witnesses who come to Congress. I never heard that radical Islamic terrorism or just even Islamic terrorists. Instead, I hear about violent extremists as if we're not talking about Islamic terrorists at all. We're talking about extremists, whoever they are. No, what's happened is radical Islamic terrorists have declared war on the United States and on Western civilization, meaning our allies in this world. And I'm sorry that you can't use those words because it takes away from the confidence that we could have in your efforts. And in the fact that that seems to be something that indicates something, that it would be, in my mind, that you are taking a law enforcement approach versus a counterterrorism approach. And law enforcement is a great deal different than than counterterrorism. Law enforcement is that you basically will try to find out who's committed a crime and punish them for it, and maybe to go out and to find out who's in a gang and try to get a message, as you've described, and messages from people in Indonesia who are speaking out, Muslims who are speaking out against this terrorism. But counterterrorism is you're dealing with monsters who kill innocent women and children, target them in order to terrorize a population. It is different than law enforcement. Totally different. Not totally, but some major differences in those approaches. Let me ask you specific, and again, I'm afraid this administration and what I've heard today does not sway me from my apprehension that there's a problem there in the definition of what we're trying to do and the definition of who we're trying to get to, or who we're trying to eliminate. Because we're not trying to eliminate violent extremists. You know, that's not what's attacking our families and people throughout the world. It's radical Islamic terrorists. Let me ask you about the Philippines, which I've spent a great deal of time in over the years. I understand there was recently an Abu Sayyaf terrorist attack in the Philippines. Is that correct? Could you give me some details on that?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Indeed, a subunit, a splinter group of the ASG was involved in a conflict with Filipino security forces over the weekend. We understand this cost the lives of several dozen Filipino security force members, and we express our deepest condolences. This kind of violence, kind of conflict costs real in terms of human lives and local security. It, however, does not diminish the fact that the Philippines has had success in recent years in degrading the capabilities of this particular group. Small numbers are left. They are a threat. The Philippines is taking it very seriously, but achieving success.
Yes, we had a special forces team there for a number of years, and they did a great job. And let me also note the State Department is focused on that part of the Philippines and done a good job as well. And we should remember that Ramzi Youssef, after planning the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, where he ended up in the Philippines. And he was there. I am still trying to find evidence that he was in some way associated with the Abu Sayyaf terrorist network and other people who are affiliated with that. Yeah, this is a major threat in the world today. This region is not immune. It could get a lot worse. I have reports that the situation in Mindanao is a lot worse than those of us who have been watching and believed it to be. So I look forward to working with you as well as with our chairman to make sure we all do our best to defeat the radical Islamic terrorists who want to murder us. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask one more question. I mentioned that when I was over there, I visited one of the madrasas. You know, and I think a lot of my constituents, when they hear the term madrasa, they conjure up something in their mind because some of these madrasas in the Middle East have been used for recruiting purposes and indoctrinating purposes. But I learned while I was there that the term madrasa just means boarding school. That is the term that they use, and it's a very typical way of educating the children. You mentioned, Mr. Murphy, that you are very concerned about the radicalization and the recruiting that happens in prison. Are you concerned about that possibly happening in some of the schools? And how well do you think these governments are doing at dealing with those threats as well?
Mr. Chairman, I will again thank you for leading a delegation out to Indonesia and would encourage all members of the committee to visit Southeast Asia. Our embassies and consulates will take good care of you, and you can see firsthand our engagement across the board in Southeast Asia, which is really...
If I could just interrupt, the folks in our embassy there were second to none. They were amazing. Really, really talented, wonderful individuals, and I couldn't be prouder. But every time I go across the world and I visit an embassy, I always feel the same. I think that they are the brightest and the best that we have to offer in our society, and I really appreciate the great work that they do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will carry that message directly to Jakarta in a week and a half when I will be with our Ambassador Blake and his team. Thank you very much for that. You know, you've identified one of the issues that we watch very closely, and that is what are the vulnerabilities to extremism, and what are the drivers? And there are a whole host, and my colleagues can speak to that as well, in terms of social inequities, economic opportunities. For some, it might be religious related. I think the important thing to look at from the U.S. perspective is our whole of government broad approach to Southeast Asia, our rebalance to Asia under this administration, but our engagement in so many different areas. Youth is one of them, youth and education. We have a Young Southeast Asia Leadership Initiative, YSEALI, that has been enormously successful in drawing over 50,000 Southeast Asian youth to partner with our missions, with our president, to engage in a whole host of opportunities, innovation, technology, education exchanges. These are the future leaders of the region, and the youth hold a lot of promise. I don't think we see any particular vulnerabilities in religious, faith-based schools and education institutions, but we do see a very broad need for local governments, local entities to message very carefully to counter the false messaging that is coming from ISIL. And schools and youth would be no exception.
Thank you. Representative Gabbard, did you have another question? No? Well, thank you very, very much. This has been very, very helpful. We appreciate you coming and sharing what the administration is doing in Southeast Asia about global terrorism. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. And without further ado, this meeting is adjourned.